Well, thank you, everyone. In particular, I think we have a nice WGU audience here because this is truly a treasured opportunity to have these three esteemed men here who were so, quite frankly, they were the source of WGU. Whether it was vision or execution, these three individuals to my right really helped create WGU. They formed it. The idea was manifested not only in articles of incorporation that also brought together the partners of the 19 Western states to provide seed capital to it. They were able to attract Bob Mendenhall as really in many ways the founding president because his singular ability to actually see that vision and then the execute a path to it. And so it's truly a treasured opportunity to have these three here with us and kind of chat with them. And I'm just going to do my best to moderate a conversation among these three because as you'll probably see pretty quickly, they'll start talking and I'll just try to see if I can direct that conversation where we may want to learn a little bit more about different things. But for those of you who don't know WGU's history, nearly 25 years ago now, next year actually we'll be celebrating WGU's 25th anniversary. We researched this again because we have a number of events planned for next year, but the memorandum of understanding was signed on January 15th, 1997. And so we're going to use that as a key event to kick off a year of celebration of WGU. But it was really founded by governors of 19 Western states and territories, but in reality, that vision originated with our two governors here to my right, Governor Mike Leavitt from Utah and Governor Roy Romer from Colorado. And personally for me, having been with those two in several different cases, it's just been so fun to watch the exchange start to happen between those two as they reminisce about what it was like at that time period. I'm working on a number of different things that they worked on. And certainly WGU is one of those true remarkable impacts that they had, but they did remind me that it wasn't the only thing that they did together. And so we'll talk a little bit about how they were able to see across party lines and convene many from different perspectives and backgrounds around this core belief that they had in how education can change people's lives. But since that founding, what was it, Bob, 3 years after that you joined as the, was that right?
2 years, 99.
2 years after that. So in 1999, Bob joined, and then subsequent to that, we had our first graduate. So that's how that happens. You hire the right president, and then you have a graduate. so it started working, yeah. But Bob then led WGU for 17 years before I had the opportunity to join. And I think few would probably understand the nature of building a startup as well as Bob does. And particularly in a highly regulated space where everyone has an opinion about what education should look like, not only at a federal level, but a state level, and then endeavoring to do it very differently than things were done before. And I think we'll have an opportunity to hear from Bob and his perspective on some of the things that he had to overcome in those early years. And we'll ask him some, I wouldn't say challenging questions, but it'll be interesting to get their reflection about some of those early things that they faced in forming WGU. I just also want to recognize that we actually have three of our graduates here today. Jenny Kirsch right here in the front, she is our first graduate of WGU. So at her graduation, it was likely you and like 10 other people, if I remember, all congratulating you, including the governors.
And he gave me the alumna shirt.
There you go. Singular. And we also have Solomon Tarascano, who's somewhere here, hopefully, and then also Chris Woods is with us as well. So,
take a quick call.
Yeah. So, and did I see Chris here? I don't see Chris here, but they'll be with us here as well this evening at the celebration and recognizing these three gentlemen with the Lifetime Achievement Award. But from Jenny's first graduation till now, we are nearly 250,000 alumni, and that's amazing. So. And there's a good possibility that within our 25th year that we may pass 300,000 graduates in that year too. And as I heard one time when I was talking about that incredible growth in the number of graduates and the increasing graduation rate and the number of graduates that now WGU has in terms of total alumni, and someone joked, he said, yeah, and one big difference between that hundreds of thousands of alumni is most of yours are still alive. And when you think of that 25 years, I don't know if there's another institution that has scaled its impact as quickly as WGU has. And so that is in large part to all of the incredible contributions that each of you are making to WGU and really internalizing the same mission and purpose that these three men had. And so without kind of further ado, let me just quickly introduce from my far right to my immediate right, we have Governor Mike Leavitt from Utah, Governor Roy Romer, formerly from Colorado. Well, I guess you're still from Colorado. Former Governor Roy Romer from Colorado, and then Bob Mendenhall, President Emeritus from WGU as well. So without further ado, gentlemen, let's first start with the simplest question, and anyone can jump in, so I'm not going to ask one or another, but maybe this goes to the governors first, is like, what was the motivation overall for originating WGU as an idea? What motivated that?
I was a relatively new governor, and I recognized that every time I went to the legislature, we were spending a lot of our money on buildings. And every time you build a building, there was a maintenance budget that had to go with it. And it just was growing and growing, and I could see as well, we were going to be seeing student populations grow because of people needing to be retrained. And I could see the inefficiencies that was there, and I think in conversations with Roy and many others, we could see technology coming. There's got to be a way to change the paradigm, and it was evident that trying to change the existing higher education industry would be very difficult. And we concluded it was a time when Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, was first coming onto the scene. And so this idea that you need to actually reinvent by creating something that would disrupt. And we had I went to a governor's conference with the Western governors, happened to be in Park City. We had a governors only meeting every year where the governors would sit around and just say, this is what's worrying me. It was raised at the table, higher ed is worrying me, am I the only one? And Roy jumped in and said, no, you're not the only one. And we had a conversation that literally led that, in the course of that meeting, to the idea being framed up, and we agreed that we would have the next time we met, which was going to be in Las Vegas, that we would try to move a plan forward that could begin to frame up what WGU would look like. That's the way I remember it. Roy, is that?
That's good. I first got to say how much respect I have for my colleague, Mike Leavitt. This is one of the world's great human beings. I just want to say that personally. And I've often said, you can put on my tombstone, here lies Roy Romer, who can't remember what he did, but can remember who he did it with. and I just got to recognize that. Let me say how important WGU is to me. I was born in 1928. I'm 92. I was born in the middle of the Depression. Well, I lived through the Depression in the Dust Bowl, way down near Oklahoma. And I graduated with 17 people from Holly High School. I had the opportunity to develop my life through education. I knew people who graduated with me who had more talent than I had, and they never got a chance at it. So all my life, I have been interested in opening those doors and giving opportunity to people who weren't blessed like I was. And WGU brings that opportunity to them. It brings it at a cost and at a quality, which is just, in my judgment, it's one of the more important things I have been involved with. My particular contribution when we and Mike got together, he was into technology. I was into competence. I'm a pilot. And you know, it doesn't care, you don't care how long you sit in the damn seat, it's whether you can land the plane. You know, it's whether you can perform what you know. And so I wanted to bring that to higher education. And the thing you got to put back in the context, these were radical ideas to fellow governors and to everybody else who ran an institution in your state. And they were threatened by this. But this, and I'll finish this by saying, when we got to the agencies that, the grading agencies, what do you call them?
Accreditors.
Accreditors. They were so wrapped up into the Carnegie seat time thing. When we walked in the door and said, no, you got to base it on performance, that was a fight. It was really a fight. And it finally turned because about 10 governors stared at this whole bunch of people who were opposed to us and said, are you really going to take us on? Do you really know who we are? And you've lived in a tradition that's got to change, and you got to be very thoughtful if you're going to walk out of this room opposed to us. I mean, we used political muscle to change those rating agencies, and great. It was great we did that. Sorry.
Yeah. You were there for a good portion of this, Bob, but I'm curious actually during that time period is, you certainly hint at this knowing how radical this idea was, but even if you were able to incorporate that, if you will, or get that MOU signed, it's not like it was like, hey, you got the golden,
No, it still took us 4 years and lots of meetings. I should just go back as Roy did, from my college days. I just thought we did education the wrong way. We know that students come to education knowing different things and they learn at different rates, but we stick them all in a classroom and we have them sit there for the same length of time and listen to the same stuff, and some of them already knew it all and are wasting their time, and others need to go slower and never learn what they're supposed to learn. And technology just has this power to individualize it to individual students. And I started in this before there were PCs, and we didn't really have computers that could make it happen. And finally now we're at a point where computers can really make a difference. But to your question, after this meeting of the governors with the accreditors, initially they had said, we're not going to accredit an online institution. They didn't even realize they had to accredit a competency-based institution.
That's right.
They didn't want to do online.
Yeah.
And
what a risk to our reputation that would have been. It's like, right? I mean, that's part of it is just that, right? The online itself was perceived as inferior.
Because of No Child Left Behind Act long ago and other things, accreditors sort of gradually came around to we'd really like evidence of performance. And ultimately, when they did their visits, I think they were converted to the model. And then 10 years after that, we get the Inspector General's office that says, but we're doing seat time.
Yeah.
And we're back in the same argument again for 3 or 4 years, which you were able to finish off.
I would just like to point as part of the history here is that Bob did not tell me about the Office of Inspector General Audit before I chose to join WGU.
We had it under control.
That was a very interesting call in the fall of 2016 where we had the auditors read us the draft report, which concluded with, as a result of your non-compliance with the X, Y, and Z issue, you owe the federal government $712 million and change. And you're just like, okay, well, but that was, that kind of leads to one of these interesting perspectives that each of you could share. I think we were long past some of those early years, but I think it would be interesting to hear from you. Are there times, and what were those times when you may have doubted that it would work? So this idea may, in fact, if you will, die on the vine, that it wasn't going to work.
Look, this was a startup. And anyone who's been through a startup knows that there are many times you think, I actually, it was a very difficult period because every dollar we had to raise from someone. We had no appropriated, we had the $1.6 million that we had raised from, actually it was $1.1 million we had raised from 11 states. But that does not go very far. And so we had to raise every dollar. And there were literally many times when we didn't know how we would meet payroll. And we would be on the phone trying to find someone who would donate money to meet payroll. Now that is classic startup experience. There were, when we began to run into roadblocks, when people were doubting whether or not competency linked to technology could actually produce what we believed it could. And we were pushing against so many different obstacles. We had then an unexpected change in the leadership that we had to work through. And that's the point at which Bob, I mean, a person who's not here but deserves some credit is Charlie Johnson, who was my former chief of staff. And I called Charlie and said, I need you to spend some time figuring out what's happening here. I just feel like we're on the verge of failing. And if nothing else, we need to find a way to gracefully land this plane. I don't want it to crash. And he came back and said, yes, this is, you've got to find a new leader who can take this to the next phase, because we were doing so many things with temporary. He found Bob. And Bob began to execute in very simple ways, and we started to scale the vision to be what we could deliver on and take it one step at a time. So there were many times when it really felt fragile.
Can I add to that? I knew how tough money was, and I was governor of Colorado. And you get certain federal funds that come to counties based on minerals, et cetera. You're supposed to use it for the benefit of the counties. I got all these funds for the Western Slope counties, $2 million. I gave it to WGU. Just
With that act, he saved WGU, I can tell you that.
I gave it to WGU.
I think the statute of limitations is up on this too, right?
And I believe so much in this institution. Not many people know what governors do with money that doesn't go through the legislature. So I didn't have to answer too many people, but the ones I did answer, I said, look, we have all these students in Western Colorado who don't have adequate access to education, and this is their access. It's maybe in another state, but that was my excuse for putting the money in, and it was a
very good excuse, too.
Yeah. Let me tell you another thing about, I see right now in politics you can't communicate if you're a red or a blue label, you know what I mean? We had such a relationship. I was I was 12 years governor, and I was leaving. Mike had 2 years to go. And this institution needed tender loving care and a sponsor. Now my memory may be faulty, but my memory is I went to you and I said, we got to move this out of Boulder to Utah. And you got to be the sponsor of this because I'm gone and I don't know that my successor is going to do that. And so it was just, you know, you don't usually as a governor give away an asset, but this one, they needed a sponsor, and Mike, he made this work. He and this president made this thing work. I had some ideas, but I didn't make it work like you guys did.
Well, this institution succeeded because of a lot of people, and Roy's
Yeah.
one of them, so an important one.
You know, we talked about how often we were wondering how we were going to make payroll and continue, and we talked some years ago about the idea of loaned reputation and the number of people that stepped up and just loaned their reputation to the institution before we had students, before we had anything but a vision and a dream. And you know, there were educators like Sam Smith and Clara Lovett who were leaders in traditional education, who were big supporters of WGU. And then there were these corporate chieftains that just stepped up. I remember Governor Lovett had a meeting with Scott McNeely at Sun, explained the vision. Scott pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check for $500,000. You know, that was payroll for several months. And again and again, I think people stepped up and supported this when it could have floundered and could have failed.
On this particular point, it would be interesting, I think, most, because I don't think I even heard it when you were being recruited to join WGU, which was basically still pre-operation, I mean, it was still seed stage. And
We had
you
no
already,
students.
yeah. So you had no students, and you already were in education. I mean, you knew accreditation and regulatory overhead and state authorization. You knew the incumbent kind of faculty-centric model of, you knew that even if governors who had their own public higher education.
No, I didn't know any of that, or I wouldn't have joined.
Well, that's why it's just like, okay. So what I would love to hear, what we'd love to hear is, what were you thinking, and what did you see that was sufficient for you to say, I'm going to bet on this, that I think I can help it be successful, that I can bring to reality the vision that these governors have.
So I had done a startup with 3 others in technology and education, but it was K-12 education, and we ended up taking it public. And so I knew technology and I knew education. I knew nothing about higher education. I think one of the things that appealed to me about this is if we could just show the world a better model, everyone would accept it. Well, that's what I didn't know about higher education. That they weren't going to accept it. But as I recall, Governor Levitt and I had a conversation. He said, look, just fly out with me to the board meeting we're having on WGU. It's in San Jose. And we'll talk about it. So we flew out on the state plane, and we had this conversation all the way out about his vision and Roy's vision and what WGU could become. And then we walk into this room, and there's like, I don't know, 6 or 8 governors and 6 or 8 CEOs of companies. Eric Schmidt, who was then at Novell, and Scott McNeely, and a number of others. And all these governors and corporate chieftains were behind this and pledged their support. And my feeling was this is a chance to ultimately implement what I'd been trying to do for 20 years already, which is get technology and education integrated to really provide a better experience for students, and particularly to serve underserved students. And with the support like I saw in that meeting, I was like, we can make this work. Maybe it was naive, but I really wanted another shot at making technology-based education successful.
Yeah. One of the things I've shared, I think, one afternoon when Mike and I had some time together, and I don't know if I ever shared this with you, but one of our board members currently is Joe Fuller, and he's a former colleague of mine at a consultancy that I worked for him, and he's now at the Harvard Business School. But I discovered after I had joined WGU that he, in fact, monitored the consultancy. He had actually done some of the consulting work for the governor, for Governor Levitt in this work, and he made this funny comment to me. He's like, yeah, we did that work. He said, but frankly, we never thought it was going to work. And so he wasn't the only doubter. And I'm just curious as to how did you face some of those doubters? Because like I mentioned, it's like you as governors, you had your own public systems that were taking large shares of your state operating budgets, right? And so you had also that kind of, you had accreditors who thought that, oh no, it has to look like this, operate like this, et cetera. You had federal student aid eligibility. Like, give us a sense of what you saw as some of the biggest hurdles that you had to take on in helping this thing take root enough to where then it could advance.
Well, we've mentioned several of them. You have to start with finding the money, and then all of the resistance that you'd come from the system as it currently was constituted, which all of this sort of proves that I've often said that a lot of things that if you knew, a lot of things are dependent upon a steady supply of people who don't know what they're getting themselves into.
We're looking at all of you still. It's like
and I just think we just kept moving forward and it was based on some very basic principles. It was true that technology would take information to where people were and not have to go to a campus. It was true that competency was a better measure than seat time. It was true that the system needed to be rethought. And those basic principles just kept us moving forward. And I'm sure at some point the fear of embarrassment played in there too, as it always does. We just needed to keep going because what we were doing was right. And look, I just think we also ought to acknowledge, I've been doing some writing, and I mean, I can just count innumerable points in time when you feel like a miracle happened. When somebody showed up with a check at just the right moment, and when some person stepped forward and said they'd stake their reputation on this at just the right moment, when Roy Romer would find a way to come up with $1.5 million out of mineral lease funds at just the right moment, this organization could have failed at any of 25 times. And somehow it just continued to move forward. I think of Jenny. We needed a student.
Yeah, that's a key ingredient.
I mean, think about this. You're asking someone to subscribe to a master's degree at a university that's not accredited, and for which you're the only student, or one of the few. That that's pioneering in any form of the definition. And the WGU story isn't one story. It's 100 different stories, all converging around 3 basic principles. And somehow, at the end of the day, it began to gather a sense of continuity. Look, the mission drifted from here. I mean, we were going to be this, and then we were going to be this, and then we were going to be this, and this is. But ultimately, it was those 3 principles that drove this.
I don't think I ever actually doubted it was going to succeed. I don't know why. But it was the right idea. We had the right backing. It just took putting your nose down and doing some hard work and making it work. This is how higher ed keeps systems out. You know, you go to be accredited and they say, well, we can't accredit you until you have students, until you have graduates. Except nobody wants to be a student at an unaccredited institution.
Right.
So it's this catch-22. You can't get students, therefore you can't be accredited. You're not accredited, so you can't get students. We bought our first students. Like, Governor Leavitt put together 50 scholarships from businesses in Utah for teachers to get a master's degree in learning and teaching, which was our first degree. We basically paid them to go to WGU so we could have some students and create some graduates so we could ultimately get accredited. It was an interesting time.
Yeah. I was just thinking of that same point that Governor Leavitt made before, is like you relied upon people who didn't really know what they were getting into. So even for you, Jenny, is like there was probably a big part of that in terms of the bet that you made on something that was certainly, as much as you may have believed it, it wasn't a certain outcome yet. We will offer an opportunity for those of you who are listening to maybe ask a question or two. As you think about what you might want to ask them, here's another question for you. When you think about WGU and the overall work that was undertaken to establish it, what do you see as some of maybe its most lasting or impactful innovations?
Well, I like the cost at what nobody's demonstrating that you can do this for the price you're doing it. And that as I've seen the impact of student debt and the accessibility barrier that cost is, when I read your annual report, the first thing I looked to was the quality, because that I wanted to be sure you're maintaining. But the impact of that cost, I think eventually is going to be dramatic in America. Somebody need to demonstrate this can be done. We still got some very inefficient and expensive higher education out there that isn't worth what people are paying for it. And so I like that example.
That's a really good one. I don't know if there's a greater crisis than the affordability one in higher education than that one. So That was a great one.
So I spent a lot of my time in healthcare. And the comparisons between what's happening in the healthcare world and what's happening in higher education are quite direct. For example, in healthcare, there's not good ways of being able to measure quality. The cost is never considered.
Yeah.
And in fact, the higher the cost, the better you assume the care to be.
Yeah.
There are typically someone other than the student or the patient paying for the health care. Same in higher education. And in healthcare, the world is beginning to look at the word value, which is the combination of cost and quality.
Yeah.
And I believe that the lasting innovation of WGU is that it was value was introduced to higher education through the delivery of high quality in a scalable way. When you think about the entire capital structure of WGU is less than one university library. And yet there are 150,000 students growing at a cost that's value. That's real, demonstrable, high quality at an affordable cost that's scalable. And it came from the basic principles that we started off with, which is deliver it using technology and measure what's real. Those are the principles. And I think that ultimately will be seen as the foundation principles that will continue to allow WGU and hopefully other universities. We didn't start off just to do WGU, by the way. We believed that if we could demonstrate it at WGU, ultimately others in higher education would begin to emulate it. And it's taken 25 years, but I don't know if you see it yet, but I do. There are a lot of people beginning to say, what is it about what's going on there that allows them to be sustainable? And I think that's going to be ultimately the great success of this mission, is that we didn't just form a great institution, we began to plant the seeds of transformation in an entire sector.
I would talk about the lasting impact a little differently. I think when I think about it, the first thing I think about is this 250,000 graduates, with the number increasing by 50,000 a year or whatever it's increasing. The impact on those individual lives, but on their children's and on their children's children. You're about 10 times more likely to graduate from college if your parents did. And we served people who had generally some college and no degree, and without WGU probably wouldn't have gotten a degree. And I think it's generational. It's going to impact not only them, but their children and their grandchildren. The impact of education on a single life, much less a couple 100,000 lives, is dramatic. And I think that's an impact that we all focused on as we worked, and what really kept us together on this mission of impacting lives and making a difference. The other thing I would mention is, while we haven't really seen large-scale adoption of exactly the WGU model, I have seen in lots of places adoption of pieces of the WGU model. There are places now that are centralizing grading and changing the instructor role to be more of a mentor, and that for instructors to spend more time with students and less time grading. There are more essentially competency tests that really measure what students know and can do. The last frontier is sort of changing the time base, and that's all wrapped up with federal financial aid, and it's going to take a long time. But because the principle's right, I think we're going to see it change as well. People just don't want to sit in a classroom for years learning at the same pace as everyone else when they're all learning at a different pace. We don't learn at the same pace, and we don't know the same things.
What you're mentioning, Bob, is, let me just add to it because I think it connects with something, Governor Romer, that you shared early on, which I personally found incredibly moving, your own experience with education. Because I think this is still something that sets WGU apart from every other institution with which I've interacted, now having been in higher ed for 5 years, is that I don't know if there is a more student-centric institution on the planet. And we certainly know that many of you have interacted with others who say, oh, it's all about the student, or they think they're doing about the student. But they either can't or they're unwilling to truly rethink all aspects of education so that it works for the individual. And that to me is so much, probably the most lasting innovation, is that we start with that belief in the inherent worth of every individual, and you said it in your own experience. How much talent you also were surrounded with that did not have access to the education so that they could then be empowered to change their lives for the better. Yeah. And so I think I at least would hope that all of you feel encouraged that there still is the belief that we have at WGU, and it's our first and most important cultural belief in many ways, and it's simply one by one. That we solve for the individual student and we advance outcomes one student at a time. And that's so different when you think about it, even when we have 130,000 currently enrolled students, when you have 250,000 graduates. Because whether it was Jenny, who, as the only student at a time, that's redefining definitely personalized learning, but, or whether it's today 130,000, it's actually 130,000 individuals. And each of them are having an individual experience through their WGU life. And we even recognize here that as much as we may have, even not by purpose, we may have standardized certain things that are not working for certain individuals. And because of that belief on that one by one, we're willing to disrupt even the way we're doing things so that it works for more and more individuals, so it can ultimately result in that outcome. Go ahead.
I'd like to add another element. Most of my time in this was how do we develop our skill, how do we become a part of a community and contribute to it, et cetera. But in the last few years, I have been worried about our ability to arrive at truth collectively as a society. Just look at the vaccine reaction out there right now as an indication of this. So education is not only something that enables us to, in our own individual lives, donate, give, prosper, but education is eventually got to be the tool by which we get off of this polarization that we're on and get back to where we can listen to each other and find some common truth rather than let the conspiracy theories dictate what is true in this country. I'm really worried about our ability to survive as a democracy if we don't find some way to keep the process of truth going. Academia always had this in the peer review, et cetera, but we've lost it as a society. We are just so polarized now that we can't share differing points of view because we hate each other.
Yeah, there is certainly one of the biggest outcomes of learning how to learn is that you also have to learn from each other. Yeah. And that you're actually seeing that as a unifying force in our humanity rather than a dividing force in humanity. Let's take a moment if there are questions from anyone here that would like to hear a perspective. Pat, please go ahead.
Actually, I was thinking for the group here, it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the Iraq. The Interregional Accrediting Committee and how we came to be the only university accredited by 4 accrediting bureaus. Yeah.
Just for purposes of our recording everything, let me just restate that question because we'll get a mic to you. So Pat Partridge, who was formerly the Chief Marketing Officer and President of WGU Academy, he's asking you about a unique experience that these 3 gentlemen had related to the Interregional Accrediting Commission, or Interstate something Accrediting Commission, that in fact we were the first and only institution, I think, to be accredited by 4 different regional accreditors. So the question is about sharing more about that experience of what that was like.
I think just really quickly, we had 19 governors across 19 states, which cut across 4 regional accrediting associations, and they had always done accreditation based on where your campus was. They didn't they hadn't done online accreditation yet. So they didn't know how to do it. And so they looked at this footprint and said, well, I guess the 4 accrediting organizations that have a state or more in WGU will come together and accredit them jointly. It took them a year without talking to us just to reconcile their own standards and come up with a new set of standards that was a composite of the 4 accrediting organizations. And then we began to engage with them. So we were accredited by all 4, at the conclusion of which they said, we're never going to do this again. Your headquarters is in Salt Lake, so your accreditor is going to be the Northwest Commission. And as they do with campuses, if you're accredited by one of the regional accrediting organizations, you're accredited by all, you're accepted by all of them and across the United States. So that was the exercise.
Right, did you have something else?
No.
I'll just say, I think all of us have some scars over this.
Thanks, Pat, for bringing
But in the final analysis, they did come to realize that this was the future. And I think they also came to understand that they needed to figure this out or someone else was going to. And to their credit, I think they became pretty good partners. And I think it was hard to bring 4 accrediting organizations together because there are a lot of politics involved in the accreditation world. And there were critics and those who were proponents, and they needed to bring that together. And so there was an inevitability about the complication of it. But again, looking back 25 years, it's so important that we confronted that obstacle and didn't try to go around it. Yes, we could have gone to other accrediting organizations, and we could, but Bob made the decision, we need to be regionally accredited, and we're going to scale that wall no matter how long it takes. And in the final analysis, I think they've become pretty good allies.
Oh, I think that's absolutely a true statement. Just from my own experience having participated with the Northwest Commission in their own review by NASICI, which is the national kind of committee that oversees the accreditors. And I participated at their invitation because Northwest Commission is arguably today at the forefront of accrediting innovative institutions. They're very different than how that many may have looked at education before, whether that's online or competency-based or disaggregated faculty model. Like, they have learned and advanced their own thinking as a function of supporting WGU in its own history.
So I'll just remind Roy of a humorous moment. This first meeting I referenced in Las Vegas, where we all brought someone from industry, and then we also brought the head of our higher education community. I think in the industry they call it the Shio. So we're sitting around a large scale, and we're all talking about accrediting and how they're the barrier and da-da-da-da-da. And I remember the governor of Hawaii said, "Who are these people?" And the higher education head from Colorado said, "Governor, it's us." And that was a moment where I think we all realized there's a lot about this we don't know, and we've got to work together.
It's funny. The problem is us. That's what it sounds like that was. Any other questions that might come from the audience? Over here. Wait, Ashutosh, for the mic to get to you. Jeff, we can get the mic. For those of you who don't know, Ashutosh Tiwari is our Senior Vice President and Executive Dean for our College of Technology.
So I definitely meet the criteria of I didn't know what I was getting into when I joined. This conversation has been incredibly inspiring. So I'd love for you to pull out your crystal ball. And you talked about the 25 mountains you guys scaled when WGU could have failed. I'd love to to have you guys pull out your crystal ball and talk about what are the next 5 mountains the rest of us should be thinking about and how we should scale it. We have a long way to go still.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Who wants to start on that one?
What was the question? The next 5 years?
Yeah. The question is like, if you were to pull out your crystal ball, given what you've experienced in that first 25 years, if you will, of WGU, and all the mountains you had to summit, what would you see as some of the biggest barriers in the next 25 years?
Well, I will just say, I think it's absolutely necessary that we continue to innovate, that we not believe that because we're based on the two sound principles that we cannot continue to innovate. We have to continue to innovate. And I think the kinds of things I'm seeing happen now with stackable degrees, that's an innovation that ultimately its time has come, and we need to lead in the way we do it. I think continuing to find new sources of competency and recognizing that we are in many ways accrediting learning, but we're also, I think we need to spread what we've learned about measuring competency around, because all of those things are at the heart of our foundation.
I think we, at least I, used to view education as a part of the early part of your life, and the rest of it you took it and did things. I think education is going to be a continuing process in everybody's life, because the world is changing so rapidly in many ways that we've got to continue, no matter, you're not done when you're out of high school or out of college or you got your first job. You got to continue to learn. I'm still learning, and I need to still learn. So I think that's one concept. The other one is in measurement. I was the chairman of Clinton's goals panel when they originally formed it. And we killed that good idea by putting too much weight on testing people. You follow? We put punishment into the test thing. And it got a sour note out of it. But we need to go back and really figure out how you honestly and accurately test what you're doing. Because if you can't test progress, you don't know if you got it. And I just think that we've got to get testing to be used as a way to help us teach rather than as a way of punishing.
That's a good one.
I'm concerned about increasing inequality. I think in the US and around the world, the gap is increasing as opposed to decreasing, the haves and the have-nots. And education's the key to closing that gap. And I think the great mission that WGU and education, higher education generally can perform is to reach down and get education down to the people who are underserved and are not able to access it. And in that regard, I think WGU's got to drive its costs down. The cost to the students. It's traditional in higher ed, we just raise tuition every year because we can, because students don't have a choice. And technology, as we continue to innovate, ought to enable us to put more and more individualization with the computer or with technology, more and more of the grading that way, and pass those cost savings on to the student rather than investing them in something. But I really think a mission of the future would be a role to close this gap in inequality by serving the underserved.
So I agree with Bob. I think I have a fighting chance to be around for the 50th anniversary of WGU. And I hope when that occurs, I can look back and say, WGU became essentially the foundation of a national university system based on competency that will drive the access to higher education to every neighborhood and be accessible to every person in a way that they can afford it. And I think that can happen. Now, it may not be under the corpus of WGU, because there's still a sense of locality that's important. But I think the way that we've begun to see WGU in various states and incorporated into public systems of higher education is an indication of how that might occur. But I think it's achievable. I think if we continue to innovate, continue to share, continue not to let our ego get in the way, something Roy and I have been talking about, the reality is there's very few limits to what this can become.
I want to add to that. Tonight we're supposed to get an award, and I always have trouble with awards because my mother was a Methodist, and she said pride was the biggest sin you could have. But it seems to me we were just doing our work. We were governors, and our job was to try to get this educational opportunity expanded. And so we came together on these approaches and ways. We're not heroes. We just were doing the job we were supposed to be doing. And so I really think that's a good example about, in looking at the future, ordinary men and women doing their job together with a sense of community can create great things. And we need to get into a political and social culture in this country where we can share better and listen to each other.
Let me maybe, just as we wrap up, kind of extend this point that's being made right now, because I do think that as we contemplate where WGU is today, it certainly wasn't anticipated nor expected by so many who early on were even seeing it at its founding that would have the kind of scale and reach and impact today as the institution is. I'll just give you an anecdote that I had also with Governor Levitt as we were kind of shaping up our kind of next, our next phase of WGU's endeavor and our mission. And many of you have heard us talk about this kind of 10X notion of like, how do we, having reinvented the institution of higher education, the institution, leverage that as a platform to really embark upon reinventing the whole system of higher education. And some have actually mistakenly assumed that that meant that we're trying to 10x increase the number of students enrolled at WGU. It's like, that wasn't it at all. It's actually about how do we leverage the innovation that we've been trying to drive to propagate that across all the others that have a shared belief or believe in the shared ideals that we have around education's ability to help people change their lives and are willing to invest in similar innovations that will drive greater outcomes for the individuals that we are intending to serve. Back to this core point, Bob, that you were raising, which is it's always been about the individual. How does education help that individual change their life for the better? And it's not just that individual, it's that individual and their family, it's that family's children, it's their children's children. Like, the generational impact of education is really what we're about. And I think that the recognition of this vision, the anecdote I'll share is like when I was articulating it to Mike as best I could, Mike replied with what he hinted at earlier. It was like, Scott, that was always the idea. It was like, I was like, oh great, I had no original thought in this. Like, but it's just like, goes back to the point is like these governors, they saw a very big picture. They were trying to govern whole states with millions and millions of residents, millions and millions of which were left out of opportunity. And they're trying to figure out how to reshape a centuries-old model. And they knew it had to be proven first with an institution. I think that's really what I learned from Mike's comment, is like, you couldn't have that big conversation until you could prove first that it could be done. And that institution of WGU that is today now gives us a mechanism by which we can invite more and more to the endeavor, if you will. And I might end with one of the simple kind of caution, because it goes back to what Mike and what Governor Levin and Rumber said, which is, let's be careful we don't let our own ego and hubris get in the way. That WGU is of a scale now that either other institutions and technology companies and a variety of different partners out there, states included, et cetera, that they want to partner with WGU because of the innovation we're driving, or they simply just want to learn from the innovation that we're focused on. Others don't ignore us because, in fact, they're worried about what WGU is going to mean for their own institution. The reality is that what we have to do is approach all those engagements with grace, with a great deal of vulnerability and empathy to say, we're actually working for the same goal, which is how does education still be the surest path to opportunity? And so I would kind of emphasize the point that Governor Levitt and Romer were saying, which is, let's not let ego get in the way of the pursuit of our mission. And so it's been such a pleasure to be with these three gentlemen and just hear from more of their vision. It's also just a pleasure and a privilege to be associated with an institution that believes in what Bob said, which is this isn't just for the individuals we're serving, but it's for their families and for their children and for their children's children. So let's show how much we are grateful for the vision and the effort they put forward. So.